Hey everybody, this is Austin here for a very special video edition of the Teacher Starting Fires podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the resources triad elements. And if you're watching on the video, we're going to have some visuals for you to see. If you're listening on the podcast, don't worry, we're going to describe everything in detail so that you don't miss out on anything. So let's go ahead and get started. Jesse, why don't you describe a little bit more of what we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, so in a couple of the recent videos that we've done, that I've done responding to different social media posts, we've covered some of the idea of these core triads that we use in adventure education, and they all stem off of, so for each one it's basically a triangle with 3 words around it. But it's the foundation for experiential education. If you're not familiar with Teachers Starting Fires, basically, Austin and I both worked separately for about 10 years in different kinds of experiential education, summer camps, Peace Corps, teaching English in foreign countries. And then I transitioned into the classroom. After we spent a couple years working together running an indoor adventure center, I went into the classroom for about 5 years, and in that time discovered a lot of what is in the outdoor adventure education world could be really, really useful to teachers. And that's kind of what we're doing now, is trying to share that with as many teachers and principals as possible. Our triads are this idea that we had to teach not just teachers how to do adventure things, but we had to teach a lot of adventure people how to be effective teachers very quickly and how to lead groups effectively. And we used the Core Triad. It's basically this expedition mindset. It's the mindset that taking people on trips naturally builds up and that can be very useful in the classroom. And the basis of it is, again, a triangle, and the 3 words around it are self, team, and resources. And the idea is that anytime you go on an expedition or an outdoor adventure, or in the case of your classroom, all you really have with you is yourself, your team, and your resources. Now, just like in any school, any expedition teacher, any guide has, they have a company they work for, they have administration that helps oversee them and guide them and get them clients, that fills their classes. But really, as we all know as teachers, once you are in the classroom, there's really not an emergency button. There's really not much that you can bring in to help you out with. It is the people that you have in that classroom with you, and whatever resources are in that classroom. Now, we've talked about the self and the team resources. We've got a big focus on basically, developing yourself as a leader, as a guide, as a teacher, in order to do your job well, and also focusing on building up all of the social connections and turning your random group of clients or students into a team. But today we're talking a little bit about a resource triad, which is basically a triangle that has the word resources in it. Each one of our main self, team, and resource groups has its own triangle as well, its own triad. This one, we've got 3 points around our triangle, which is minimize, master, and maintain. There we go, if you're watching the video. But minimize, master, and maintain, which basically is like the rest of our framework. It's a mindset that develops around how to use your resources when you are an expedition leader, or in the case of being an adventure educator, which is what we're hoping to get more and more teachers to become. If you are thinking about the resources in your classroom, then it is learning how to minimize those, master the ones you have, and maintain the ones that you have.
So Jesse, when you talk about resources, a lot of us are thinking right away, yeah, that's something that I just don't have enough of. I can't get the funding for it. I don't have the budget. I try to do grants, but that takes a lot of time and it's very competitive. So what kind of resources are you talking about?
Yeah, so resources, I mean, you have a couple kinds, basically physical resources, which are going to include a lot of, what you're thinking of: paper, pencils, supplies, art supplies, whiteboards on the walls. Technology resources. A lot of schools are moving to be one-to-one with iPads or one-to-one with Chromebooks now, which, I mean, they have their advantages if you're using Chromebook as the textbook now, or getting interactive content, right? Obviously, all these things are very beneficial. The other kind of resource, though, that we're going to talk about is, and it's part of building up your team, is the team dynamic of our triads, but thinking of your team, thinking of the skills that you have, thinking of the skills that are in the classroom, basically anything that's a non-physical resource as well. And that can be time, that can be your ability as a teacher. A lot of times teachers, I think in PDs, every time a new idea is thrown out, we've got kind of 2 reactions. One is, if it kind of contradicts what you're good at, you just don't like the PD and you're like, this is dumb, I'm going to ignore it. Or if it's already what you're good at, like maybe you adapt it a little bit, maybe you're using it, but for the most part, you're like, yeah, this is kind of what I already do. For me, what you do, what you're good at is the resource that you have. And so learning to, again, minimize, master, and maintain your teaching resources. In the case of minimize, which we'll talk about first, but in the case of minimizing non-physical resources, like, yes, having 1,000 tricks up your sleeve is great, but really knowing how to use 2 or 3 of them very well, I would argue is much more valuable. In the same case of physical resources, I've seen a lot of them. I think we've probably all worked with teachers or heard of teachers or talked to teachers who are kind of getting technology overwhelmed in their classroom, where because their school has access to 10 different types of pieces of technology they can use, they don't really know how to use any of them very well. And that's not, necessarily any more helpful than not having those pieces of technology.
So by minimize, you're meaning that you would want to focus in on a core set of resources and then train up to do them at a high level.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of, a lot of what we talk about is how these expeditions, how outdoor education naturally builds up a certain mindset that you might not have otherwise. And minimizing your resources is something that comes very naturally outdoors. Like, as you spend more time outdoors, as you get used to it, you have less and less and less stuff. And as a guide, you might actually still have more stuff than most people, but it's because you're carrying all these extra things for the group, the first aid kit, all this extra emergency stuff that you even might share with the group. But I always remember we went on a hike, and there was this packing list that nobody had really edited very well. And it went out, and it had this random section that was have your pocket knife, have a watch, have a compass, have hardware. And I have no idea why hardware was on this packing list. But most people saw it and was like, I don't need that, or I have whatever I need. Who knows what it was really intended in the first place. But one of the youngest kids on this trip was struggling the entire backpacking trip. And finally, halfway into it wasn't a long one, but it was halfway into a 4 or 5 mile hike, with him lagging behind, we were like, dude, we got to go through your pack. What do you have in here? And so, one of the items was rope, and everybody else brought small string or some things they could use to stake up a tent. And this kid had this giant spool of 50-foot rope that was, not even helpful rope, just a gigantic thing of rope that, he'd looked around the house, and it was the cute little kid from Up, basically. He was the little scout from Up, slightly overweight, adorable kid, super energetic. He was a ton of fun, but you go through his backpack and he has this giant 50-foot spool of rope that I think, he just didn't know. But then we got to the hardware, and he had a Ziploc bag that was just, it was random bolts and nuts and washers from his dad's jar of junk hardware that doesn't go anywhere. It was probably 2 pounds of just metal, absolutely useless. Most of them didn't go together. We're backpacking in the woods, and this kid has 2 pounds of metal in his backpack that he's carrying, right?
It's like someone played a practical joke on him.
Right. He walked, and basically, right, everybody who had any outdoor experience, or we would argue common sense, was sitting there staring at him like he's crazy, because we're like, what are you doing? And he pulls out the packing list. He's like, boom, hardware right here. Look at that. And you're like, okay, you got us. That was our bad. You did a good job following instructions as you've been taught in school. Maybe we should have been teaching critical thinking more than just instruction following at school, right? Which is part of what we're doing. But the reason I bring that up is that in the outdoor world, minimizing is something that happens naturally. That as you get better and better and better, that student, or that student never again would bring a random 3-pound bag of hardware, because it was a learning experience, right? And he's not going to bring that. And he's going to figure out how to bring smaller rope, and he's going to figure out how to pack better and minimize what he needs and master his ability to use the things he does have, and then maintain those things so that when he's out there, nothing breaks down, and that the things that you do have actually work the way they're supposed to. And I think that's the idea of minimizing. Outdoors happens naturally, but in the classroom, we're all trapped really in the same consumer culture, that it's you need the bigger television screen, you need the bigger computer, you need a faster computer. Yes, we all have a 1-to-1 Chromebook, but now I want 1-to-1 iPads, because those are a little bit better and we can do just a little bit more on it. Mm-hmm. The same idea though, having that 50-foot rope doesn't really help you at all if you don't need the rope, and you don't know how to use the rope, and you don't have there's nothing that you absolutely need that rope for, right?
Right. So how does this relate to the classroom?
Right. So the teaching example that comes up for minimizing resources is one of my intervention position where I spent most of the class year pushing in and helping math teachers, helping different teachers in the school. By pushing into those classrooms, I got to work with a lot of different teachers, but in the summer, there were only like 3-4 teachers in the entire school. It was a pretty small charter school, and we were running a summer school program. So I was teaching math and science in these like long 3.5-hour block in the morning, 3.5-hour block in the afternoon. And so as I was teaching math and science, there was another teacher teaching English and social studies, and there was another teacher kind of managing the program and doing some other work. But two of us, the manager and myself, we had both taught, with super minimal resources outdoors. She'd taught in Madagascar in the Peace Corps, I think, and, had spent 2.5 or whatever years teaching outdoors with no resources, no chalkboard, like nothing. You're in literally a hut with no walls, teaching a group of 20 or 30 kids. I'd taught at summer camp for years, teaching 30 to 50 kids. Well, I guess really some are small. So like 10 to 50 kid classes in the woods with nothing. Sometimes they all have pocket knives. You're trying to get 15 people to know how to rock climb, right? In all those cases, the core elements of teaching, keeping students engaged, classroom management, having a safe environment, keeping people like actively participating and involved in processing and reflecting and learning, all those things that we teach on the teaching side of Teachers Starting Fires, that was all part of what we'd both done. Now, the third teacher was a great classroom teacher. Had I think I want to say Michigan, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, somewhere out there, kind of a general geographic region, but she'd taught in classrooms for about 20 years and only new classrooms. And so the reason I bring this up though is that one morning the neighborhood had a power outage for basically the whole school day. And for the first 3 hours, like it didn't even occur to me that this was an issue. That like, yes, of course, I'd had some things we were going to do that required electronics. I had some plans, but you show up and there's no power. And so you adapt and do something different, right? And that's minimizing. It's like, for me, power is a nice resource, but it's in no way necessary. The same thing, the teacher who'd been in Madagascar, it didn't even occur to her that anything was going to go wrong, right? Like she doesn't have too many students. She's doing admin work. She can't do any emails or anything. She's like, okay. So she, does what she can around the school and helps out and does the rest of her job. At lunch, we started switching classes, and it turned out that the classroom teacher, she had planned on watching like a movie and then doing Chromebook essay work on it, and, was heavily electronic. And it was, a U.S. history class or world history. But either way, you have, hundreds of years of history that you get to teach, an unlimited number of things that you had to teach. And you only have to keep a fairly small class engaged for 3.5 hours teaching anything from all of history, right? And power outages are a great time to stay off your phone, do something quiet in the classroom. It was a well-lit classroom. It had windows. There was no reason that a power outage should have influenced the class at all, right? It turned out that this teacher, because she didn't have her standard resources of power, she spent the entire morning basically doing nothing. They didn't do any handwriting. They didn't do any work. Now, of course, that sounds absurd, right? She, though, was not a bad teacher. She was good at teaching. She was used to classroom management. She had a good relationship with the students, but she was so unused to not having power that she basically, she spent the morning just sitting around with students talking about how they couldn't do anything and how outrageous it was there was no power, and kind of getting into the cycle. So by the end of the first 3.5 hour block, her class was so angry and bored and disengaged and upset with the summer school program that we had to cancel the second half of the school day. And for me and my entire class, and for the teacher from Madagascar and everybody she'd worked with, we were both just dumbfounded, because our class, we'd run a perfectly normal class. Everybody was like, wow, that was cool. We didn't even have power. It's kind of neat to have, just a classroom with window light. And the third class, though, absolutely collapsed and fell apart and had no success whatsoever. And the idea is the same way that I've seen, many different versions of this, but teachers who, we had a teacher who, couldn't find graph paper and would photocopy one sheet of graph paper over and over on the copy paper, and did thousands of sheets and wasted huge amounts of money for the school because I don't know, something about like they weren't willing to fill out the papers to get the proper resources in their classroom kind of thing, right? And that idea too of like, there are so many different ways that they could have been graphing or learning the exact same things, or right, like there are some indispensable resources, but for this idea of like keeping students engaged, keeping them learning, keeping them getting prepared for life, there's really very, very little that's absolutely necessary. And learning to think in this minimal mindset instead of our consumer mindset that makes a classroom fall apart in a blackout is part of what adventure education can teach.
Okay. So minimizing, that makes a lot of sense, and I can see the importance in that. You mentioned that there's another part of this triad about maintaining. What does that have, like, how do you, so basically I would imagine it's something like minimizing the resources that you absolutely need and also working to maintain them by keeping them up to date.
Yeah, I mean, this one's pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of pieces kind of developed to the maintaining, but yes, outdoor world, if you don't put away your ropes correctly, if you don't take care of your stove, if you don't clean your equipment, if you don't, make sure your fuel is not too old, you might freeze or starve to death somewhere, right? If you put away your tent and never dry it, you might have a moldy tent the next time you open it up, which is not enjoyable for anyone. In the classroom world, it's similar. Again, a comparison between, there was basically, it was almost half and half, but we had laptop carts, and about half the teachers would, zip tie their cables up. And again, it's pretty minimal. We don't have a technology person. We have, everybody's kind of doing their own thing. But the principal spent a bunch of money on nice laptop carts, full sets of Chromebooks for everybody. And half the teachers would zip tie their cables and make sure that the laptop cart was organized and teach their students to put their laptops in the correct spot. And really, it was not difficult. The exact same student population in one classroom would be like, oh, we put away our laptops in the number we got them, right? Mm-hmm. And they would do it, and you had very high success rates. Almost all the laptops are plugged in. Maybe the teacher would go in and help one or two, but especially because you had numbers, you could even then say like, hey, laptop 19 is you, make sure you plug in your laptop next time, and they would do it, right? Those exact same students in another class, the teachers, several different teachers would say, hey, students just aren't going to be able to put their laptop away. It's always a mess. What does it matter? Put all the laptops wherever. And it was always, 2 or 3 to a slot, piled up, left on top, left on the desk, like just horribly maintained. And there are two downsides to that. One, for the teacher, we upgraded laptops a year later, and the teachers that had been maintaining their laptop, they all got new laptops. And the teachers that did the worst job of maintaining their laptops, of course, were not given the new laptops. We were only able to upgrade a certain number, right? Mm-hmm. So immediately, that's a real consequence, just like for the teachers, just like moldy tent, because you didn't put it away, that's a consequence for you next time you go outside. Your stuff gets rusty or falls apart, that's your life that could be in danger. In the classroom, then, the second part for me is I would argue you're not preparing your students well for life, because all of these triads that we use, we know apply to students as well as teachers, right? So if this helps a teacher lead a good life and be happy, this will also help a student lead a good life and be happy. And that those students that only had teachers who took care of their equipment, they learned to do that with their own stuff, right? Whereas the students who maybe only had the teachers who kind of teach just, through demonstration, reckless regard for your equipment, that's what they learned. And if you treat your car that way, or your clothes that way, or, your non-physical resources, your relationships that way, or your friendships that way, they fall apart. And if you maintain them, they don't. Mm.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That reminds me of, I was reading about what's going on right now in Joshua Tree National Park, and the park system is at minimal capacity right now, but right. They have minimal staff. They wanted to keep the park open because it's good for the local economy for people to go and use that space, and then they go to businesses. So, but I just read today they actually had to shut down Joshua Tree Park because people were getting in there and taking advantage of the fact that there weren't rangers to stop them from doing these things, and they were off-roading through the desert and burning trees and carving on rocks, and basically just like acting like it's Mad Max out there, only because there weren't park guards to stop them. And it's the mentality is really interesting because these are the same people who, under normal conditions, wouldn't do that. Just like the students you're talking about, in one classroom, they follow the procedures and they put their laptops away. And then in the classroom across the hall, they just leave their laptops strewn around because suddenly the system is a little bit different. The procedures are a little bit different. Something's changed. And that's something that as teachers, when we're setting the expectations in our classroom, we should always keep in mind about how we set these procedures and expectations so that people follow through and do them every time. And we
Right.
don't.
And I mean, part of it too on that is explaining why these are good habits and letting people find the value for them themselves. And I think that's like that awful example of Joshua Tree Park. That right, like these students were at this school were super at risk that I mean, as you saw cars and everything else come in, just nobody in their life really, for many of them, had taught them how to maintain equipment, how to take care of something that's yours, how to have a sense of ownership, and maintain things because that's the right thing to do. Whereas I know too, like at some of the, really high SES schools I've worked at, even if you had a teacher that was like, I don't care where laptops are, a lot of those people have, like a lot of those students will have had these values already kind of put into them throughout their entire life. And you would like naturally have students being like, well, I have laptop 19, so of course I'm going to put it in spot 19, even though I've never been told to.
Right.
And I think that's a huge part, is that like, if part of what we get to do as teachers is help create the kind of the cultural norms for the future generations of our country, you have to be really careful that you're doing a good job of that and making sure that, in this case, maintaining equipment, maintaining personal property is just a value that makes you more prepared for life and makes you a better citizen, ready to be part of, the society as a whole.
Right. And the important part of that is like teaching people why we do things and not just how to do them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, like one of the core ideas in adventure education is, education is an experience you're creating to help other people discover a truth that already exists. In the same way of like engaging science classes, you do experiments and discover some realities about them, or think about like, why didn't this work well? And you discover a fact about the world through this experiment that you do, right? You're not just given a list of facts to memorize. But I think the same is true for behaviors. Like if you're just told, hey, this is your behavior, do it, and you don't like that behavior and you've never bothered to find a natural reason to do that, or a reason you believe in, you're going to stop as soon as possible, right? But the people that like, to the Joshua Tree example, if you have been in nature before and you've learned to respect nature and why that's good, and found a sense of fulfillment from that, then you're naturally going to keep doing that whether there's a park ranger there or not. But if all that's ever happened is you go outside and you're like, why can't I burn this tree? Oh, because the park ranger told me not to, as opposed to like you actually have an understanding of reality and why being good is good. That's a completely different experience as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that leads finally to our third point here on our resource triangle, which is master, which ties in pretty well to minimizing your resources, maintaining your resources. Why do you master your resources in the adventure world, at least?
You need to know how to use them in order to get the most out of them. Right, so if you're going to do something like in the adventure world, if you're going to have rope, if you're going to go rappelling, you need to know how to use all of the tools to the level of mastery and not just halfway there, because the consequences of making mistakes are falling down a cliff. And same thing in the classroom. If you're going to use a certain classroom management technique, you need to understand the complete technique for that method in order for it to be effective. Because if you don't understand it fully, it probably won't work. And when you tell people it didn't work, you probably won't tell them it didn't work because you didn't understand it. You'll probably say, oh, well, it was just a bad management technique. Whoever told me that was stupid. Right?
Right.
So you need to master the tools in order to really be able to judge their effectiveness and to make them work for your students.
Yeah, and I mean on that, I just saw like a week ago a principal on I think Principals Leadership Group Facebook page talked about they had a post that was how do you get teachers to like actually try a new educational method
Mm-hmm.
instead of just try it with quotes once and then give up on it, right? And at the
Right.
same time too, I mean, if you need different results from your teachers, a lot of times like helping them master a method they're already familiar with is probably going to be better, I think, than teaching a completely new method. But that idea, like what I thought of last time you were out here. So last time Austin was out in Colorado, we
I
went and
remember that.
climbed. What's that?
I said I remember that.
Yeah, it was not long ago.
Yeah.
But we went and climbed one of the Flatirons up in Boulder, and there are these. It's like 1,000 feet or more of climbing, but it's at a bit of an angle. It's not that hard of a climb, but
Oh, hold on.
yeah,
I've got to describe. If people haven't been to Boulder before, these are like these Flatirons. It's like this huge slab of rock that is over the town of Boulder. Anywhere you're in Boulder, you can see the Flatirons like going like up into the sky. It's a distinctive feature. It's amazing and inspiring. Rock climbers come from all over the world to climb these things, and
yes,
some
yeah.
people climb them without rope, though we had rope on.
Yeah, we tend to people also, it's like at least one person will roll down one of these for 1,000 feet and die each year, which is Austin and mine's main motivation. Like we didn't fall, we didn't use the rope once, but at the same time, had we would not have died.
Let me clarify.
Uh,
We used the rope. We just didn't test it.
right, yeah, I guess we were both tied in and using the rope correctly. If you're not familiar with rock climbing, but we never fell onto the rope because we fell off the rocks, right? So, anyways, the as we were climbing this, Austin and I both had a lot of training in our adventure backgrounds in rock climbing and setting anchors and knowing how to use all the equipment. And basically, there's a lot of different things you use to hook your rope to the rocks. And there's all these different kinds of anchors, is what they're called, but you can attach them in many different ways to the rocks. And being able to master one or two of these anchors gives you this huge variety of ways to hook to the rock and to rescue yourself and to lower yourself and to change where you are on the rock and to do it all safely. So Austin and I, even when we came into weird situations, because we've spent a lot of time mastering, or working towards mastery, you never really can master, but working towards mastery in setting these anchors, we were very comfortable the whole time. I did the same climb with another friend who's very good at climbing, but not very familiar with these anchors. They normally climb indoors or in these routes where you just clip to bolts in the rock. But the big point is that they had almost no familiarity, no mastery of setting anchors. And so when we would get to a couple difficult spots that more than anything just took kind of a creative way to set the anchor, they were much more nervous. They were much more stressed out. They were much more um, generally worried, which then affected their performance. And I think that's similar as if you're great at one element of teaching, but you haven't mastered the two or three things that are going to help you in every situation. If you have instead, built 1,000 different very small tools for different situations, as soon as there's any depth or complexity to what you're doing, then you're going to have a harder time adapting. You're going to have a harder time being comfortable. And just like this climbing friend, you're going to be more nervous. You're going to be afraid. You're going to be uncomfortable. And that's going to impact your ability to perform. Even if it's something that you're normally really good at, like climbing for this person or teaching for, anybody who's been in the classroom.
Yeah, and this is something that comes up a lot with new teachers, right? They're fresh out of college. They have taken all their classes. They've got their diploma. They have all of the resources that we can provide them up until the point of actually having a classroom of their own. And a lot of teachers really struggle in those first 2 years because although they have academic understanding of the teaching methods, they don't actually have mastery yet. And so they feel stressed out and exhausted and overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And that mastery, and we talk about this, and really the only way to really do it is to do it. You have to practice and practice and practice.
Yeah, and I mean, we have content on working towards mastery. Even on our closed discussion group, which is I want to say facebook.com/adventure education secrets. You can join that, but I've been breaking down, I think if you're watching the video, here's the book cover, but I've been breaking down Daniel Pink's Drive, which is all about human motivation, if you're familiar with it or not. But his three main points are to make people naturally motivated, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And so, we've been talking about mastery there as well, and the idea of turning whatever task you're doing, whatever ability you have to use your resources, into something that really gets you into a flow state and takes, the 10,000 hours towards mastery and all of these other elements of mastery that we won't break down right now, but are part of that triad as well.
Yeah, but that URL is facebook.com/groups/adventure education secrets.
I left out the word groups. Facebook.com.
But I bet if you just search for adventure education secrets for teachers, then you would find it.
Or again, Teachers Starting Fires on Facebook, and you'll find us and all that. So I think that's pretty much that element of our core triad. That is the resources core triad: minimize, master, and maintain, or minimize, maintain, master. Teachers Starting Fires is a project Austin and I have been working on. We're excited to share it. If you are listening to this or watching the video and want to see some of the other podcasts, slightly different topics, a little bit longer ago, that's going to be on Stitcher right now. And if you, again, search Teachers Starting Fires on Stitcher or on the Stitcher app, you're going to find our podcast as well. And we appreciate you watching or listening.
Have a good day.
Onward to adventure.
Onward to adventure. That's right.